Oh, you got that?
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay. As Lillian said, I was a Denver police officer for 39 years. I finally retired just a couple of years ago. And I was, during those years, I started my cult research all the way back in 1976. And the reason I got involved is at the time I was going to a church where a young lady was involved in a cult for about 3.5 years. It was a nomadic cult. And at the time, the church I was going to was raising funds. I remember her name was Rachel. And they were raising funds so the parents could find her. And I found out later for the purposes of getting her, and eventually they did. It took them 3.5 years to find her. Back then, we're talking 1976, they hired then deprogrammers and found her and got her out of the group. She was in, I don't know if some of you I'm sure that have been involved, heard of the Jim Roberts group. Yeah. And that's the group that she was in, and that's where I started my whole journey down this, because I couldn't believe the kind of stuff that she was telling me and what she went through in this group. And I didn't know so much about children in that group, but she herself, because she was a single woman, took beatings and things like that. So from that, I started getting involved, and actually there's only been 2 books written on the Jim Roberts group. One was her book called Escape, which is really hard to get. If you ever really want, I got about 5 copies of it. But and the other one was written by, I think it was Jim Guerrero, called From the Dean's List to Dumpsters, and he got recruited by that group on campus. But so here I was, a police officer, and just a quick history. I got so involved. I'm the type of person, when I get involved in something, I go crazy, and I really get involved. I started infiltrating cults. I lived with cults. I went through the Moonies indoctrination camp back in 1981, and several other groups. I got inside the Way International. What's interesting, I also got inside the Aggressive Christian Ministry Corps, which Janet pointed out, and spent a week down there, which was very interesting. And I'll tell you, that woman that you saw in there,
Lila Green.
Yeah, she is one scary individual. She did not trust me at all. But I went down there because I was helping a family try to get their son out of that group down in Mexico. They're actually, what they do is they go on the campus at I guess it's a Mexico State University down there, and they recruit there. And then once they get the person in, they take them to this little town of Barreno now. And then once they're pretty much indoctrinated, then they send them up to Gallup, New Mexico, where there's a big, huge Quonset. There's about 200 people that live in there. And like Janet was saying, this group is still going. But one of the things, from a law enforcement point of view, and you covered, so many of the issues. And one of the things you're going to find with law enforcement, and the slide presentation, I don't know, I'm probably going to get through a few slides, but that I'm showing you is what I show to law enforcement. I try to get around as many law enforcement units I can around. I've traveled a few states, and I try to give these presentations because when it comes to this area, and I think as was pointed out, law enforcement is real hesitant to do anything about it. And I've even often gotten calls from parents that have called me, and they'll say that, well, why don't the police do anything? And the police will say we can't. Well, that's true and it's not true. And one of the things I've tried to teach them is, in this day and age of what we call community policing and proactive policing, which I was involved in Denver. In other words, that's a type of policing where we went out and we would see like a neighborhood problem starting to boil over, whether it was a gang house or neighbors that were arguing over whatever, so many different things. We would go out and intervene before there was any crime committed in order to see if we could prevent something. Because I remember in Denver and other places, we had people shoot each other over parking, arguing over parking problems. And so that was our goal, and that's what I did for a while. And I see, and one of the things I teach the police is, you can do the same thing here. When you find out you got a group in your area, or somebody calls you, you should be interested right off the bat. Now, you don't have to be involved in what they believe, you know, unless you want to be. But you don't have to, you know, like I said, be concerned with their beliefs and everything. But what you want to do is just get to know them, visit them. Now, I'll tell you just a quick story about the Aggressive Christian Ministry Corps, because the family I was working for eventually came out, and it wasn't because of me. It was because of a police officer in the county down there. And I hope he got a good commendation, because I wrote a nice letter to his sheriff. But what he did, he got to know the group, because in this little town of Reno, which is a ghost town, I think the only building that's inhabited there is that group. And they converted an old schoolhouse. Well, this particular deputy sheriff down there would go down there when he was working, almost on a daily basis, just to drop in and say hello. And when I talked to him, that's what he said, because I was always concerned with all the stuff I've heard about cults, what was going on there, what could be happening to the children. I just wanted to make my appearance. Well, so when these parents came from Kansas, they came down there and they went to the group and they said they wanted to visit their son. And of course, the group said, no, you can't, which is amazing. You know, I mean, that's a typical cult, right? I mean, he was an adult. He was about 22 years old at the time, but they said, no, you can't visit him. So they went down and they ran into this particular officer that worked the area. And they talked to the sheriff and he said, well, why don't you talk with him? So he goes down there, tells the parents to wait about an hour away in a little restaurant that was there. He goes into the group and he talks to Deborah Green. And what was her first name? Was it Deborah? Lila. Lila? Yeah, Lila. They talk to Lila Green and Jim, and he just basically says, you know, I've been real patient with you guys. I watched you when you moved in here. You fix up this building, which is really nice, but you never got one permit. You never got, you know, you didn't do anything like that. And, you know, he threw that in, very smart of him, and then he said, but I'm not going to really make any big deal about that. If you would just let these parents visit their son for 2 hours, I'll promise you I'll bring him back. So he did. He got him in a police car, drove him down to that restaurant. And the parents were there. Of course, he got out of the car and was really sad. His mother, who since passed away, was just a dear lady. But at that time, when he got out of the car, he pushed her to the ground and called her Satan. And what was amazing about that, they still visited with him. They talked with him, even though he never said a word. Well, he goes back to the group. And what he says later, 5 months later, he calls his dad and he says, I want to come home. And what his whole reason was, and I talked to him later, was he couldn't believe that he treated his mother like that. He couldn't believe that he did that, and for 5 months it drove him crazy. And what I'm saying, and that's why what that officer did, ultimately by giving them the contact, that would have never happened. Now that was he didn't have to do any of that, but he did. And that's just one of those type of things. Here, I'm going to sit down now and see if I can go through these. Now, I throw this in because one thing, remember, if you do call police officers or law enforcement in your area, when they hear the word cult, this is the first thing they think of, is the occult and Satanism. And you got to get them off that. You got to define the different. Now, this here is a book that was put out, and so much, I'll be honest with you, so much stuff in this area is so exaggerated in the occult. A lot of people, unfortunately, have been convicted over the years because police just went nuts on this stuff. And I mean, I think of the Tennessee 3. Anyone ever heard of that case? And a guy that I knew, actually, a retired captain from Ohio, went down there and testified that these 3 12-year-old boys were Satanists, and they killed these 3 8-year-old boys. And they wound up going to jail for 12 years. Turned out later it was one of the fathers of the 12-year-old boy that killed the 3 kids. But he was coming up, I have the whole testimony when he was in the courtroom. I mean, with crazy stuff. The number 3 is satanic. The number this is satanic. And all the reasons why these kids would have killed these 8-year-olds, which they never did. But that's just one. But I bring that up because, and this is some of the, the other stuff. This here's, Tony Kyle teaches at the Law Enforcement Institute in Louisville, Kentucky. And he's pretty good on this stuff. Santeria, things like that. That's a little more realistic. In Colorado, we don't have a lot of problems with that. But you go down to Florida and areas like that, the religions that came from Hades and Africa and stuff, a lot of weird things happen. I don't really get into that as much. This was a book written by a police officer, Captain Snow from the Indianapolis Police Department. He actually wrote a book on deadly cults. One of the only ones I know that a police officer actually wrote. Of course, Janet showed the pictures of Jim Jones. We all know David Koresh. And, you know, in this group, there are a lot of things you pointed out went in this group too. I have a sister-in-law that she became my sister-in-law because she was in the Branch Davidians. And she was in there for a couple years. And a lady down in Colorado Springs' son was in it. And Koresh kicked him out because he asked too many questions. But about 5 years later, I don't remember all the time sequence, but she said, I got this girl from New Zealand at my house, and she came down to visit me. She was actually looking for some sort of counseling because she was involved in the Branch Davidians, and Koresh kicked her out because her visa expired, and it saved her life. Koresh had sex with all the women in the group, and it was her turn, and she refused. Koresh locked her up for 4 months, and that's when he found out that her visa expired, and she went off. They put her on a plane. She went nuts on a plane. Literally had to tie her down. And when she landed in San Francisco, and it took them about a month to find her family in New Zealand. I don't know if you realize it, but about half the group of the Branch Davidians were Samoans, and they were from New Zealand, Hawaii, and Samoa. And one thing I've learned getting to know Grace, and I've been in New Zealand and I've met her family, they are very close-knit, even if they live all over the place. They still live in sort of a tribal mentality. But she lost her sister, Rebecca, in the fire. And she comes and speaks with me a lot when I'm back at home. But this here I put in because I don't know if you ever saw this in 2000, the FBI, of course, after Jonestown, after Waco, and the Weaver case and a few other cases, they decided to write an article on this. Basically, it's a law enforcement saying a lot of the same things I'm saying. Gather intelligence. Find out about the groups. Another thing you find out, sometimes a person in a group, the only outside connection they have, and I have a few cases that happened, was the police officer that got to know them. And when they wanted to get out, they called the officer. Who better to call than it'd be harder for an individual. Okay, and like I said, this is the kind of stuff I point out. This is Tony Alamo. All familiar with him. He's now serving, was pointed out by Janet, that Warren Jeffs is serving a life sentence. This guy's finally serving a life sentence for sexual relations with 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds. I don't know if any of you saw it. Oprah Winfrey had, just before, about 3 months before the show went off, she had a bunch of the ex-members and the girls talking about this. Absolutely devastating. It went on. He was doing this for over 25 years. And law enforcement got complaints, but they thought he was a good guy. He's a religious guy. This isn't true. And finally all of it comes out, and he's going to die in jail along with Warren Jeffs, which to me is okay. And Alamo denied bail after judge hears of beatings and sex with girls. All these groups, especially the Bible-based groups, and have a tendency, I'm not saying only them, but they have the tendency, the beatings, even Grace told me, the one that was in the Branch Davidians, they had a big paddle, and they would have public spankings, and spank the kids and the adults, which was, interesting. But this guy's in jail too. Anybody know who this guy is?
No.
Israeli Hawkins.
Another Texan.
Down in Texas, yeah, the House of Yahweh. He was another one that was getting involved. I think I have an article. Ex-pastor gets concurrent life terms in child sex cases. A former pastor will serve 4 concurrent life sentences. I guess that pretty much puts him in jail. Oh no, that's not him. This is another one. I got my slides mixed up here. This is a guy in Louisiana. Louis D. LaMonica. Israeli Hawkins is in jail also, but this guy's also in jail. And these guys were just bad. The whole leadership of this, and I don't want to call it a church. I mean, it's and it's funny that as you see there, he raped his 2 sons, and they both pleaded with the judge not to imprison their father for life during Tuesday's hearing. Which eventually they did. There was about 8 of them that all went to jail. And in that this is actually a picture of him, and all this was his leadership in the group. But like I was saying again, what I'm showing you is what I show. This is sort of my short version, of them here. This was a guy, a cult leader that moved from Hawaii. It's amazing how they move around. Like you were saying, the Aggressive Christian Ministry Corps moved from Sacramento to New Mexico. And I was just talking to somebody the other day. The group, I don't know if I have a slide on it, but the one, the Lord's Righteous Arm, or whatever the guy called himself in New Mexico.
Yeah, right, Wayne Bent.
Wayne Bent. He's another one now that's in jail. But he moved from Ohio. I saw that. I didn't know that he was originally in Ohio. And I was talking to Ron Burks a little earlier in Pyle about that. And he goes, "Oh yeah, that we had somebody at LifeSpring from that group years ago when they were in Ohio. I didn't know that part, but he showed up down there, and of course they look for the most isolated places. Now we all know who this guy is, right? We talk about a sex cult and the kind of problems. I mean, if you ever want to look at the documentary, I think you can get it that HBO put out of one of the ex-members, and talking about in there the sexual assault that was put on him. We all heard about Ricky Rodriguez, who grew up in this group and eventually committed suicide. That was all over the news. But of course, this guy here, I mean, I think when it comes, if there's degrees of it, he was the worst of them. Now here, this is one that came out, the Church of the Bible Understanding in Philadelphia, Stuart Trail. Anyone familiar with him? Originally was called the Forever Family. Changed the name, mostly in Philadelphia and parts of New York. But they also believed in beatings, as you can tell here. And they beat this kid, in this case, 150 times, and he died of child abuse. And so, unfortunately, Stuart didn't go to jail. He was the one that orchestrated it, but he didn't do it. So sometimes the law, that's a picture of Stuart Trail. If you ever in Philadelphia, you see the followers, they'll wear T-shirts that say "Get Smart, Get Saved" like that. And that's Stuart Trail there in all of his colored pens. It's sort of weird. He says God speaks to him and through those pens, and he actually has a color-coded Bible, and it just shows you how bizarre. I mean, this guy doesn't even, like I said, some of them don't even use the Bible. They just get direct revelations, and you see that in a lot of groups. You know, they're either God or they're getting revelations from God. I said this is a little short version of this is Albert Spriggs. Anybody know what group he's the leader of? I know we got some experts here. It's a group called the 12 Tribes. He actually lives in Myrtle Beach, North Carolina, but we have one of the tribes in Colorado down in Manitou Springs. Actually, they got smoked out from the fire that was down there that went right around the city. But another one where child abuse, again, paddling, excessive paddling of the kids. And that was probably one of their biggest problems. Who knows, what else goes on.
They also forbid their children to fantasize or imagine.
Fantasize or imagine? How about playing with toys? No.
And they have all the S's.
Yeah, we had a group in southern Colorado called the Assembly of Yahweh Yeshua. And a lot of people used to mistake them for the Jim Roberts group because they wore robes and they had long beards and everything like that. And they also buried a few children down there. Like you mentioned a child having diabetes. They had one down there. And while you were talking, it reminded me, up until 2006, Colorado allowed, unfortunately, this stuff to happen. There's a group up in Mesa County, which is where Grand Junction, Colorado is on the western slope. It's called the General Assembly of the Firstborn. And they didn't believe in medicine and had quite a few children. There's actually a graveyard of children up there. But thankfully, the legislature in Colorado in 2006 finally made it illegal to do that. And that's when I'm talking to law enforcement. That's the one thing I'm telling them. This is illegal now. So if you're here with their faith healings and they're refusing medicine, you have to become involved. Where before, they didn't have to. So thankfully, Colorado, and I hope all the states eventually, come online. But it took us that long.
Just a handful of completely repealed exemption.
Just a handful? I wonder how many. Yeah, I think, if I remember, Colorado's like only the 11th or something like that.
Is that,
But,
you said that is that the Church of the Firstborn? Is that the same as, or is this another group?
Well, it's called the Church of the Firstborn of the General Assembly. But
Okay.
I know there's another one down in...
They're active in Oklahoma. My husband worked for the medical
Yeah.
examiner there, and the MEs used to call it the Church of the Stillborn because they don't seek out medical care for birthing.
I bet they're connected, but there are also churches of the Firstborn that, if I remember correctly, are breakups of the FLDS. There's a couple called the Church of the Firstborn along that. Okay, now I don't want. This is another thing I show law enforcement if they don't want to get to, is the amount of people that are ripped off financially in cults, especially senior citizens. This guy here, Gerald Payne, was the, I hate to use the word pastor, but that's what they call him, of the Greater Ministries in Florida, and ripped off senior citizens for over $3 million. And there's so many. This is a whole different thing that some of these groups victimize, especially senior citizens. And there's some groups that are even taking senior citizens in now because they can take their inheritance with them into the group. And so that's sort of a tough area. This was finally the U.S. Marshals that ran in and took over the church. They're running into the church building there. One of my favorite pictures of that ordeal. There's Warren Jeffs. This is Wayne Bent or Michael Trevesser that we were talking about a little bit ago that moved down to. He's the guy in court that tells the judge, or when he testifies, I didn't touch the girls. I just laid with them there. And they were 14-year-old girls. I'm sure that went over real good in the minds of the jury. What? Oh, this is a guy, I just threw him in. This guy's just come on the scene. He's wacko. And there's a lot of people watching. He's in Australia, and his name is Alan John Miller. He claims to be Jesus Christ. He claims to be the Messiah. And there's already reports of things coming out. So my name is Jesus, and I'm serious. I love that. So, but the authorities are watching him over there. So that's.
Yeah.
I mean, he's in Queensland. I just threw that in to let people know everybody has their cults.
Yeah.
And actually, before I forget, there's people here, right, from locally. You all heard of the Apostles of Infinite Love? Are you familiar with them?
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. That group. I have a video that I show police officers that it was called Fifth Dimension, I guess is the name of the television show here. Yeah. That did a special on
Fifth Estate.
The what? The Fifth Estate. That was. See, I'm going back to my 60s. But the Fifth Estate, and I'm sure you guys have seen that. And the child abuse there, as you guys know, is out of control. And how they tried to bring in the authorities, even into that. Go ahead.
We had the same thing with Moses Stereo up north in the Laurentians, where the child abuse was absolutely awful. And Quebec police didn't dare intervene at that time. It took a long time before police set up their mind and went in to liberate, quote unquote, the kid and the people who were there. Moïse Stereo. His surname was Moses. It was Roggeman.
Okay, he was known more as Roggeman.
Yeah, but his surname was Moses.
Oh, I'd like to. Is that group still going?
No.
He's in jail.
Oh, he's in jail.
He's in jail.
He died in jail.
Died in jail.
He died in jail, yeah? Okay.
Oh, did he?
Oh, he was
good.
Was he
Last
killed?
year.
He may have been killed.
He was killed in jail by another prisoner.
Oh, was he? Wow.
Is that right?
He may have been.
Well, if you remember in that Fifth Estate in the Apostles of Infinite Love, when the children would misbehave or they would have even an accident, well, the first thing was once the children in that group were 6 months old, they were given over to the nuns, and because all the women dressed like nuns, and the priests looked like sort of like Franciscan priests, but they have that symbol on their But they would give them over, and the parents wouldn't see them again. And in the one case, they showed where they put a couple of the children in barrels and rolled them down and made them live in a barrel for several days. Put children in front of tractors and made them outrun the tractors for punishment. When I watched that thing, I showed that a couple times when I've talked to law enforcement, and I saw cops out there with tears in their eyes when they saw that. So, I mean, it just shows you, and that's what I tell them, you just don't know. That's why you've got to keep, when you get these groups, just visit them, just like you do anything on your beat. You know, we're told when we're working to go visit our businesses, you know, to just do routine checks. Check on them. Get to know them. Get to see if there's any changes. You never know, somebody may, you know, reach out to you or tell you what's going on or something like that. Because as we know, and as Janet pointed out, the kind of stuff that goes on and not reporting these things. You know, you brought up the Mormon church, and I just remember when I was on a Denver Police Department, a guy that became a detective in Denver, that he left Salt Lake City. Well, one of his problems was he wasn't a Mormon. And one of the things I found out, he was telling me, if you're not in the church, they'll hire you, but you pretty much are not going to go anywhere. But he had a case that there was a sexual report of a child abuse case, and he got ear of it and wanted to investigate it. And he was ordered by the church to overlook it. That's why he finally quit. He couldn't stay there. And he came to Denver, and I remember when he found out what I was doing, he told me right away, he says, that's the reason I left that city. I just couldn't stay there with them overlooking that. And she's right, they haven't. I was just up in Manti last week, you know, when they have their big outreach, and it was 5 or 6 of the fundamental groups up there. And even in the pamphlet, it tells them, if you get a complaint on one of these, call us. So they don't call the authorities. See, and that's actually illegal, you know, not to do that, which I'm sure you know, but because even in churches, pastors, they're part, like teachers, right? They're part, they have to report. Yeah, they're supposed to. Okay.
Most states don't really require it.
Yeah, so, oh yeah, this guy here, I tried to stay, this is Philip Levinson, Light of the World Ministries. He calls it light therapy. This was another one. He repeatedly performed the naked ritual, claiming he helped cure everything from drug addiction to yeast infections. He said it was done only with consenting adults who are members of his donor-funded Light of the World Ministries. But, of course, one participant testified that a teenage girl was involved also in it. And it turned out, it was funny, I was speaking at Regis University just about 3 weeks ago in Denver, and I showed this picture, and one of the girls in the class goes, I don't know if I'd want to see that guy in the nude, you know. But again, it seems like this, you know, when they get power over people, this sexual stuff comes out, and you know, and it just, you know, the abuse and all the things that come along, you know, with it. But that was more sort of my short version. I have a longer one, and I wish I could show you some of the videos, but I'm not hooked up for that, right? I have them on. Actually, if you write this down, I have a web page called, it's www.cultsandlawenforcement.com.
Cults of what?
Cults and Law Enforcement. One word?
Cults?
Yeah, one word.
A-N-D?
Yeah, and I spelled it all out. It's, yeah, cultsandlawenforcement.com. And on there you'll see videos. I try to get to keep it up with law enforcement, and all my contact information is on there too. My email address, anything if you ever needed to get a hold of me or anything like that. And
so it's .com. .com?
Yeah, .com. Cultsandlawenforcement.com. Go ahead.
What group did you find was the most troubling to deal with in your work?
Oh.
Did any of them get you more than others? You know, find it troubling to work with?
What, the ones that I worked with?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I've testified in several cases where, you know, where some parents have left the cult, and the other one was still in with the children, and then a lot of things came out in those, you know, in those things that abuse was going on, and physical. I'm trying to think of it in particular. I mean, it's hard to really to pinpoint. I mean, of the ones I was involved in, But, no, I can't, think of one particularly.
What about law enforcement? I mean, we are talking of problems and all sorts of exceptions, but when and where and how is it really possible to state it is illegal? And now these cases are more or less always rapes, raping or cruelty or ill-treatment and so on. But the point is, how does the law, what reference do you have? Because we have very few in Europe.
Well, see, one of the problems you have, as Janet pointed out, the isolation. The other thing is the victims, just like in the Tony Alamo, cult, the victims are still in the cult. They don't usually make their outcry, unfortunately, till a lot later. And by then, and one big thing, if you know anything about law and police work, outcry is a big thing with whether a case can be, convicted or not. If it takes them 4 or 5 months even to finally come to us and say, this happened to me. And, that's, what happens a lot of times. That's why once they know or they hear a group is doing these things, I'm just saying that they got to keep on it, and if families call them, because that's what happens a lot. Families will call law enforcement in the area where their child is. So,
can I have one
go
more
ahead.
that comment? In the FLD series of criminal cases where 11 guys were sent to prison, not one of the witnesses was a victim. They got it all just from documentation they found on Warren Jeff's card in the temple and DNA evidence, but there was not one outcry victim that testified because they had such a hold over the group. Yeah. See, and that's one of the problems right there. Go ahead.
Just listening to you, I see some similarities between the problems that you face as law enforcement agents, I would say, with that sort of problem, and domestic violence. Because the victims of domestic violence also keep silent, also don't complain outside, women in general that are beaten by husbands, and the police cannot do anything because there is no formal complaint. So I think these are difficult problems.
And in the cult,
how to anticipate? How can the police anticipate any problem without infringing upon the rights of privacy and so on and so on?
See, and you're hitting on all the hindrances that they have. That's what I say. They just have to be, and this is what I try to teach them, a little bit proactive. And just getting to know them, not going in even looking, just get to know them. Because one thing I found out, just like the Aggressive Christian Ministry Court, when that cop went down there all the time and visited them, even though they probably, truth known, they probably didn't like him coming here, I would venture to say. But they're smart enough, the cult leaders are smart enough not to upset him. You know what I mean? Not to isolate him, to let him come. And, maybe he'll get to know somebody, and somebody in the group will reach out to him. But you're right. I mean, domestic violence and the cult thing is intensified even more because I know in Colorado, and I think most states now, when I was on the police department the first 10 years, domestic violence, if the woman usually didn't sign a complaint, there was nothing we could do. But now, if there's any evidence, even if a neighbor calls, and there's any evidence, and we can show that there was a domestic violence, we can take the person in without their complaint. But that even causes a problem sometimes because then they don't show up to court. But that's a whole nother.
Because the religious group is like a big family, in a sense, a tribe.
And I think the control's a lot more. Oh, go ahead.
Is there any lobbying in Washington to help change the laws as far as cults and brainwashing? No.
Well, I don't know if there's any lobbying. I mean, that one statement that you showed about the religious, we have to suffer the abuses to have the freedom. I mean, you got to draw the line there because that's what ultimately the courts and everybody else is afraid of. Is that I know? Is it tomorrow? I saw on the schedule that Steve Kent, who teaches up at Edmonton University, is teaching on how the cults affect your students. I think he's going to cover. some of some of the same thing and how it is. It's a rough area. I don't.
Yeah, because I
Go
can
ahead.
answer that to
Sure,
some
go
degree.
ahead.
There are some countries who have passed anti-cult legislation that kind of understand the oppression of people and how difficult it is for law enforcement and other secular agencies to deal with them just like they would any, say, religious community. The United States hasn't ever even entertained that kind of an idea. However, there have been certain kinds of laws that have been targeted by child advocates. And in the States, there's a woman named Rita Swan who has lobbied. She has to go from state to state to lobby to get these religious exemptions to be repealed. And that's been the only way that I know of where there's been significant change. And that deals with the faith healing medical neglect problems.
Yeah, I mean, I was involved with the Gypsy group, and they made sure that the people they brought in were not children, and they were pretty savvy about the whole thing. So I guess they fall through the loopholes, and like when they asked for money, there were no receipts, nothing, no paper trails. So.
Go ahead.
I was a member of David Berg with the Children of God, which you said was one of the worst. I was their first female member in 1966.
Wow.
I have 12 children, 16 grandchildren. This is all a problem, and there's many children in these cults, but even other half is when they get out. What happens? There's not enough attention. Most counselors, they don't know what to do. They're like, oh, you're just from a crazy family. No, that didn't really happen. The kids themselves don't understand the trauma symptoms, like my son, and so many of my children, they think they're going crazy, they commit suicide, it's atrocious. And then the law enforcement look at them as, criminals. They're put in jail and made criminals, instead of being able and working with Rachel Bernstein in Los Angeles, because the way the law enforcement treats these kids, but they don't know. All they know is the law enforcement, they were taught were systemites or whatever, and they know their anger is bad, but they don't understand where it's coming from. And it's a very complicated, and it needs more attention. And I think the police officers also need to be aware and taught, to find out backgrounds and then how to deal with them, that they need to have a professional person to talk with these kids.
Yeah, you said it all. I mean, I should copy all that down, because that's what law enforcement needs to hear. And that's what you want to do, is a practical approach. I have a case going now. There's a little town just north of Denver, about 35 miles, and it's called Firestone, Colorado. There's this little bizarre cult that just formed of about 20 people. And what's amazing, he's got 20 people in Firestone, Colorado, and another 20 in Germany. Now, I'm still trying to figure this all out. But we started getting calls from parents there. Being local, I get a lot of calls like that. I took the parents. We actually met with the chief of police, because I figured I can talk these guys' languages. He was like a retired captain from Baltimore before he came and took over the chief spot of this little police department, maybe a department of 20 officers. But even there, I spent with the family sitting in his office. We set up an appointment, and I told him about this group. And unfortunately, they sort of blew it, because one of their officers went and was starting to question him too much. And all I wanted them to do was really just to watch them, to let him know that they're there. And when we talked to him, at least that day, he was all for us. Oh, I'm so glad you came to me. I'm so glad you let me know. I didn't know that this was going on. And here's the parents right here. But then when sort of through that a little bit, and I'm not trying to criticize them, but they sort of overreacted. What did the leader do? He moved her to Germany. And the mother's devastated, can't have contact. Were you going to say something else?
Yes, you told about anti-cult legislation. In Europe, there is no anti-cult legislation, but in a few countries, in France at least, there is a law on abuse of weakness. And we noticed that those who are arrested and prosecuted are not religious people, but they are notaries and they are bank managers.
Yeah. Well, I know
with old people, of course.
Well, I know that like Belgium, France, Germany, they made some serious laws against.
In Belgium,
Yeah.
yes, but it's
Yeah.
very limited, yes.
But we just got to, like, you know, like you were saying, and I mean, and for the children of God to get away with what they doing for as long as they have.
They had
I
a
mean,
case going in England for like 3 years and they couldn't convict them.
and all the lives and all the people that have been devastated by that group. So,
So it's time to close
That's
this,
time.
and I do remind you, and it will be out there if you would like.
Of sexual revolution.
Uh-huh.
Because